But I know that my prayers in this regard are quite weak, for my love of the world and my willingness to be the cause of all the problems in the world is virtually nil. On most days, it is enough of a struggle to take on prayer for those whom I know, particularly those with whom relationships are damaged, but such prayer is the path of the cross. It leads us to a place where Christ is, taking on the sins of the world for the life of the world and its salvation. Glory to God.
And that was Father Stephen Freeman with Glory to God. Father Stephen is the priest at St. Anne Orthodox Church in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, and hosts the Glory to God for All Things blog site, which can be accessed from his podcast site at ancientfaithradio.com. This is a listener-supported presentation of Ancient Faith Radio.
The ancient faith for the modern world. This is Ancient Faith Radio.
Welcome to Live with the Lows with your hosts, Father Nicholas and Dr. Roxanne Lowe, where we will connect our Orthodox faith to day-to-day living and relationships to our family, our work, and our view of ourselves. Father Nicholas is the priest at St. John the Divine Greek Orthodox Church in Jacksonville, and Dr. Roxanne is a licensed clinical psychologist who uses her extensive training in private practice. Questions are welcome by calling 855-237-2346. That's 855-237-2346. Here now is Father Nicholas and Dr. Roxanne.
Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to Live with the Lows. My name is Father Nicholas Lowe. I'm the parish priest at St. John the Divine Greek Orthodox Church in the great city of Jacksonville, Florida. I'm so excited that you're joining me on this Tuesday, January 18th show of Live with the Lows. You know, our show, the principal foundation of our show is to marry both faith and psychology to kind of give you some practical steps to apply in your walk of faith. In fact, we actually call it practical Christianity. We believe that at our core that whatever we share on a Sunday morning sermon or whatever we share on our show on Tuesday evenings, we hope that will help you ultimately give you some practical steps that you can apply in your walk of faith. So again, thank you so much for joining us tonight. You know, before we dive into tonight's really important topic, we want to encourage you to stay connected to us by joining all of our social media platforms. You know, friends, we're on Facebook, on Twitter, we're on Instagram and YouTube, and we're all under the headings of The Lows. So just simply go to your search engine in those particular platforms, put The Lows, and our last name is spelled L-O-U-H-S, The Lows. And once you do that, you can have access to all that we share throughout the entire week. And we also encourage you, if you are interested in receiving inspirational messages all throughout the week. Roxanne and I just love to inspire and encourage people. We feel like that's one of the gifts that God has given us, and to Him be all the glory. We just simply want to unwrap those gifts with all of you. So if you're one of these people that loves to receive inspirational encouragement that merges both faith and psychology, go to our website at thelows.com. Again, that's L-O-U-H-S.com. In fact, you can go right during our show tonight, thelows.com. Click on that subscribe button, and all you have to do is simply put in your email address, and I promise you tomorrow morning when you wake up, there'll be a little bit of an inspirational message that we would share with all of you. And as you all know by now, we published a book last year called Renewing You, a priest, a psychologist, and a plan, that takes basically 8 of the biggest topics that Roxanne and I see, both in her practice as a psychologist and in my ministry as a priest, and we basically tackle them from both a faith perspective and a psychological perspective. So from growing in your walk of faith to having healthy thoughts, how powerful our thoughts are, to what our purpose is on this earth, to how do we grow our marriages and strengthen them. If those are topics that really lean into your heart, we encourage you to check out our book. It's both available here at ancientfaith.com. You actually just go to store.ancientfaith.com, and you'll find Renewing You, a priest, a psychologist, and a plan, as well as we're also on Audible. We recently came out with the Audible version of our book, and we definitely encourage you to look that up as well, and you can find that at audible.com. And right before we begin the show, I just want to remind all of you that there are just a couple of rooms that are left. In fact, we are doing a retreat on February 18th through the 20th at the Antiochian Village Camp, which is located in Ligonier, Pennsylvania. It's about an hour and a half to 2 hours outside of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And this retreat actually already sold out, and then the great people at the Antiochian Village actually opened up several more rooms just because of the desire for more people that want to come to this retreat. So if you are interested and you'd like to really make over your marriage, that's, I guess what we're calling the retreat, making over your marriage, definitely check that out. It's February 18th through the 20th. You can find out more by going to store.ancientfaith.com/events, and you can find all about that, the retreat. But definitely, if you are interested, book soon, because that retreat is going to totally be booked out. And so before we share tonight's show, I do want to invite all of you that we truly believe that growth in our lives, one of the ways that it happens is through the conversation. You want to join tonight's conversation. So call in at 1-855-237-2346. That's 1-855-237-2346. We're also, you can also email us at ask@ancientfaith.com. That's ask@ancientfaith.com. And you could also watch or listen to our show live on our Facebook platforms at the Lowe's, as well as on Ancient Faith's Facebook page. So definitely, if you want to share your comments there, you're more than welcome to do so. You know, friends, yesterday we celebrated the birthday of Martin Luther King Jr., and he's the father, as we all know, of the civil rights movement, a movement that started in the 50s and the 60s that aimed at its core for social justice and equal rights for Black Americans. And in one of the most famous speeches that he gave on the Lincoln Memorial, one of my favorite speeches of all time, that he gave on August 28th, 1963, he gave his iconic "I Have a Dream" speech. And I love that one of our favorite quotes in which he challenged our nation was this quote: "Now is the time to make real the promises of democracy. Now is the time to rise from the dark and desolate valley of segregation to the sunlit path of racial justice. Now is the time to lift our nation from the quicksands of racial injustice to the solid rock of brotherhood. Now is the time to make justice a reality for all of God's children." You know, and although there has been tremendous progress over the last 50 years, we can all agree that there's still much work that needs to be done so that all people of color, and really all people in general, can experience and be treated equally. Here to talk to you about the role of the Orthodox Church that played in the civil rights movement, which is probably one of the best kept secrets with regarding the civil rights movement, and the involvement of specifically Archbishop Iakovos of the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese, and his involvement in his march with Martin Luther King in Selma, Alabama, has surely been one of the most iconic events and historical events within the Orthodox Church in America. And to talk about that, as well as African American spirituality in relationship to the Orthodox Church, is a very dear friend of mine and an amazing speaker and priest. He's an African American Orthodox priest named Father Paul Abernathy. Many of you may have heard or spoken with him, but he is also a relative of the late civil rights leader Ralph Abernathy. Father Paul is the CEO of an extraordinary ministry called the Neighborhood Resilience Project, an organization that aims to serve the underprivileged in the inner city of Pittsburgh. Their ministry, by the way, has been highlighted on Dateline NBC and Lester Holt, as well as the New York Times. In addition to working to his ministry within this organization, Father Paul is and has been on a number of community boards and committees and has received numerous community awards. Father Paul is the priest at St. Moses the Black Orthodox Christian Church. He's an author and a husband and a father of 2 great children. Father Paul, welcome to Live with the Lowe's. We're so grateful that you're here with us tonight.
To be with you.
So, Father Paul, let's get started. I know that both of us share a great love and admiration for Martin Luther King Jr., like many of our listeners. What about Martin Luther King Jr.'s message do you think resonates with Orthodox Christians today?
Yes, and whenever we consider Martin Luther King, a lot of times in America, we're focusing on Martin Luther King, the civil rights leader, Martin Luther King, the great orator, Martin Luther King, the champion of political achievement. But for us Orthodox Christians, whenever we look at the life of Martin Luther King, it's important to see that Martin Luther King, first and foremost, is a man of faith. Where really his personal journey to civil rights begins, it begins with his belief in Jesus Christ. Certainly we know that he's a Baptist minister, but he's not an intellectual Baptist minister. He is a minister who has taken to heart the gospel. He is a minister who is indeed a man of prayer, and his life reveals that. You can hear in his speeches constant reference to Christ in his gospel. It is in his appeal to live that gospel out, understanding that justice isn't just putting the bottom rail on top. You know, W.E.B. Du Bois, in his book Souls of Blackbird, he talks about the failure of the Reconstruction era, the Freedmen's Bureau that was established after the Civil War to help these freed slaves be integrated into society. And it was a great failure. He talks about one of the reasons why that failure is because there was this attempt to try and put the bottom rail on top. If you really hear the speech that you just referenced with Martin Luther King, he talks about justice in the context of brotherhood. That is to say that Martin Luther King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and they really were very intentional about putting the word Christian in that. This organization championed civil rights, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. They said that we must desire justice and reconciliation, not victory. And we really hear this. We understand that from his perspective, from his life of prayer, from his embracing of the gospel, that there could be no justice without reconciliation.
And I was reading and watching a video.
And I was reading and watching a video that's actually published within the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese when the late Archbishop Yakobos of blessed memory marched with Martin Luther King Jr. in Selma. He alludes to that. He kind of touches on that, what you're just sharing, Father Paul, when he says this. He says, so when Martin Luther King Jr. had his walk at the courthouse in Selma, Alabama, I decided to join him because this is my time. And he uses this phrase to take revenge against all those who oppress people. And that's coming because he lived in Turkey and experienced a time in which he was not given the same rights as everyone else was within Turkey, and so he knew firsthand what the injustices and how that related to people, and felt that it was his duty, even at a time when not everyone was in favor of him doing so, stood for justice because he came from an experience similar to that. So I think it's so important that and maybe just kind of building on that too, Father Paul, is, in the Orthodox Church, so much of what our church, when we look at the history of the Orthodox Church, it seems to have this 2,000 year of history that would be great to say that it was all in just euphoric and great times, that it's all been the golden era of the last 2,000 years. But what we know is that there have been times of great injustice that take place. In fact, some would argue that we're still experiencing that level of injustice in certain parts of our world. Maybe can you speak a little bit about just maybe some of the general tenets of the civil rights movement and how it's really appealing, how it appeals to us as Orthodox, because we have such a very similar history of injustice on a faith level, that maybe many people in the West who are just hearing about the Orthodox Church may not be familiar with.
Father, this is a really important point because the experience of Orthodox Christians is, it's important for people to understand that the Orthodox Church never participated in the slave trade. This was not part of our history. The Orthodox Church didn't have these forced conversions of Native Americans like happened with Western Christian traditions, whereas in the West there's this experience of Christian triumphalism. In the Orthodox Christian East, there is, just as you say, this history of oppression and extreme oppression, this most extreme oppression. Like you rightly say, Father, the Archbishop Yakobos, he grew up born in, of course, 1911 in Turkey, where he experienced in the waning days of the Ottoman Empire, and really to understand how horrible it was at that particular time, and even to the point where we talk in this country about slaves were sold on average at least once in his or her lifetime. And what was it like, what it must have been like for those of us who are parents to imagine our children being sold away from us, or our children to imagine what it must have been like to be sold away from their parents. In the Ottoman Empire, this was an experience too, where Christian children were taken. Orthodox Christian children were taken by the Ottoman Turks to serve in elite military military units, they were made slaves, they were raised as Muslims, and that pain, that experience of pain and persecution was well known by the Orthodox Christian East and personally by Archbishop Diakonos. What's really fascinating is, and I think this is the part of the story that also gets lost to us in America, is that it's not only that the Orthodox Church experienced oppression in the Ottoman Empire. It's not only that the Orthodox Church experienced oppression in the under communism or in other parts of the world, but we have to understand that here in the United States, Orthodox Christian faced discrimination as well. The very same white supremacy that Martin Luther King was struggling against was the very same white supremacy that Orthodox Christians faced here in America. And fascinatingly, the Immigration Act of 1917, and this is one of the reasons why Archbishop Diakonos, when he looked at in Selma, 50%, over 50% of the city is black. Only 2% of them were registered to vote. Of course, we know this by history. This was because all of the hurdles that they put these folks through, African Americans through, to try to put tests in their way so that they couldn't qualify for voting, and trying to intimidate them from voting, trying to punish them for voting, taking away jobs and meeting all kinds of threats of physical violence. The Immigration Act of 1917 placed very similar measures on, for example, Greeks, to try to prevent them from citizenship as well, where there was there were things that were put on them that were not put on immigrants from other countries. And in 1924, the Immigration Act actually limited the number of Greeks. I believe it was only 100 admissions per year from Greeks, because there was this idea that these people were less than. We can't have these Greeks running around. We can't have these Arabs running around this country. Greek and Arabic communities, Orthodox communities faced white supremacy, whether it was the burning of businesses and homes, which absolutely happened, or even lynchings in some instances that absolutely happened to these Orthodox Christians, not overseas in the Ottoman Empire, but right here in the United States of America. There's a lot of people that talk about Archbishop Diakonos and sort of when he was going there, that he did receive some ridicule for going to Selma, Alabama. It's also very important to understand that when he went to Selma, it was just a short while after the murder of Reverend James Reed. And in fact, if you look at the famous cover photo of Life magazine, where Archbishop Diakonos is standing right next to Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King is holding a wreath. That wreath is actually meant in remembrance of Reverend Reed, who was killed by white supremacists just a short time before the march. And here's what's important to understand is that Archbishop Diakonos, he went to Selma understanding what happened to Reverend James Reed. He went to Selma understanding that a Christian clergyman had recently been murdered for promoting civil rights. When he went to Selma, there were people who were saying to him, "Are you sure you want to do this? This is not safe for you to do." And he understood this Archbishop of the Church, that he was going to do this not only for civil rights, but that he would personally put himself at risk. This is in the tradition of the martyrs. This is in the tradition of the martyrs. And even he said, "We've nothing to fear. We have nothing to fear. We have the fullness of truth. We have the gospel of Jesus Christ. We have the grace of the Holy Spirit. The cloud of witnesses are with us. We have nothing to fear." We must do this. We must do this as a faithful witness of our Orthodox Christian faith. And so for us to understand that particular context, I believe is very important, that we Orthodox Christians, we do not share that same heritage that had implemented white supremacy in this particular nation, but actually resonated more with the people of this country who had
If you're just
suffered
joining
at
us,
hand.
we're speaking with Father Paul Abernathy.
If you're just joining us, we're speaking with Father Paul Abernathy, who is the CEO of an extraordinary ministry called the Neighborhood Resilience Project, and we're talking to him not only about the ministry that he does, but also as an African American Orthodox priest. We're talking also about, in light of the celebration of Martin Luther King Jr., what the role that the Orthodox Church played in the civil rights movement. And so we're so excited for you to join us. We encourage you to call in at 1-855-237-2346. That's 1-855-237-2346. You can also email us at ask@ancientfaith.com. That's ask@ancientfaith.com. We actually, Father Paul, have a caller, Jackie. Welcome to Live with the Lows.
Great, Jackie. Thank you.
Hello, how are you?
Great, Jackie. Thank you.
Pardon my voice. I'm in the midst of COVID.
We're praying for you.
Oh, we're praying for you.
Thank you. A couple of things I wanted to share. First, thank you so much, as always, for your brilliant airings of important issues. My grandmother, Virginia, met Dr. King in Charleston, South Carolina, when he marched past her Greek grocery store. She gave him a Coke. So that's our family connection to Dr. King. So that's our big, and her birthday was the same day as Dr. King. So we have that little connection. And then Archbishop Jacobus frequented my parish in New Jersey as a child. So I met him several times. But what I want to share is that many times we forget that the legacy of Dr. King included that he was a man of God, and that his courage and his strength was anchored in his faith, and that in our fight for social justice, I do advocacy work and community work, but I find many times that we decide who deserves our mercy in our fight. And what I love so much about Dr. King was that he was radical in his love and mercy. Yet today, many times we politicize our mercy, and we forget that we're all God's children, and that we all need protection, and that we should all be supported, and that no one should be unfairly attacked, either our lives, our livelihoods, or our city. And I feel that this is part of a conversation that really needs to happen, but instead sometimes what happens is we distort the light that Dr. King represented, and we make it into something else. Can you address that?
Yes, please.
Thank you, Jackie. Father Paul, yes, please.
Thank you so much. Father, certainly, Jackie, thank you so much. I'm just so grateful for this particular comment. When I hear people, when George Floyd was murdered, there were a lot of people who called up and they called me or they emailed me and they said to me, Father, we want to be a white ally. This is the term they used, ally. And this really struck me because this indicates, I think, Jackie, to your point, how far we've come from the Christian message of Dr. King. We talk a lot about now being allies, and in that particular sense, we're setting the current stage as a battleground. You know, allies or from my particular perspective, they're a political. They're a political reality. You know, someone is a political ally. They're our ally in time of war. Incidentally, someone is only your ally as long as it's politically expedient. I always remember Malcolm X talking about this when he talked about that the government told us we had to, during World War II, we had to hate the Germans and the Japanese and love the Russians and the Chinese. And when the war ended, he said they told us we had to love the Germans and the Japanese and hate the Russians and the Chinese. And this is really kind of how allies are. You know, they are allies as long as it's politically expedient. Going back to how Father Nicholas started us off tonight, Martin Luther King never once talked about allies. He talked instead of our brothers and sisters. This is one of the ways in which we see such a stark difference between the political movements of today and the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s that was led certainly by King and many others who were men and women of God, who understood that, again, as I had referenced earlier, the justice, there could be no justice without reconciliation, and we could not have reconciliation without justice. This whole message is rooted in the gospel of Jesus Christ. He absolutely was a believer. He had spoken to a group of students at UCLA Berkeley in the 60s, having this conversation with them. Many of them, you can tell from this conversation, were not believers. And he said to them, even if you don't believe, you have to admit there is no possibility in doing this work without, at the very least, cosmic companionship. That was his attempt to speak to atheists and tell them that you cannot do this alone. And in fact, in his own personal life, what he came up against, what he endured, the struggle, the weight that was on his shoulders, he had regularly to appeal to God. It was even the threats that he faced to continue in his work on a daily basis. Famously, he had this moment in his life. He referred to it as his spiritual midnight. In the early days of the Montgomery bus boycott, when someone had called him in the middle of the night and said they were going to kill him. They were going to bomb his house, his family. And he said that he was driven from his bedroom to the kitchen by fear, where he would pray. He was praying in his kitchen. An older woman had heard him preaching in the church in this particular period, and she went up to him and said, "You've lost your conviction." Of course, he tried to play it off, but what had happened was she sensed the fear that was in his heart, and she said to him, "You can't fool me. I know something's wrong. Always remember this, we're with you. Even if we're not with you, God is with you." And this, in the context of the spiritual midnight, he talks about this prayer that he was praying in his kitchen, where he really did hear. He said he heard a voice, which he ascribed as the voice of God, saying, "You've got to continue in this. I am with you." In this whole notion that God is with him, and that he is a witness of the gospel, is central in his life. Whereas he's not just doing this for a political victory, but it is for him very much a ministry. I always like to say, you can't talk about Martin Luther King, the civil rights leader. You can't talk about Martin Luther King, the orator, without also talking about Martin Luther King, the pastor. He knew what it was to pray with people. He knew what it was to bury people. He knew what it was to feed the hungry. He understood on a pastoral level what it was to be in relationship with those who suffer. And that, in his love of Christ Jesus, in whose name all of this he is done in, is at the center of his work, and it radically characterizes the civil rights movement in a way that currently social movements do not embrace. This is our work, however, as Christians, as Orthodox Christians, to not just do this work, but to do this work as the disciples of Christ, to preach reconciliation, to preach this unconditional and undying love, to speak in behalf of all of those whom society has forgotten, to uplift them, to heal the wounded, to heal the brokenhearted in the name of our Lord. This work, the same Holy Spirit that moved through Archbishop Yakovos and many others in the 50s and 60s is moving through us here today. We must be vessels of
Jackie,
great
thank you
mercy.
so much for your call. I
love
really
that.
appreciate it.
Jackie, thank you so much for your call. I really appreciate it. It was just and definitely sharing those stories that I know that you'll treasure for a lifetime of your family, and giving a Coke to Martin Luther King. So thanks so much for joining us tonight. We're very appreciative of that.
I love how you were sharing
To get
that.
back to what you were saying, Father Paul, I loved how you were sharing that, and I was thinking back yesterday just of some of once the bombing that took place in Birmingham, the Baptist Street church bombing that we all saw, or we all read about, at least in horror, that took place in 1963, when those, I think it was the 4 African American girls that were killed in that bombing, and how Martin Luther King here we have a church being bombed. And the response that Martin Luther King, and giving that eulogy, said that death is not a period at the end of a sentence, but only a comma towards something greater. That even in consoling and comforting those families who lost their daughters, how he never forgot, at least in my readings and in studying him as well, never forgot his first responsibility of being a pastor. And he tied everything that he did within that. And I think that's so important that sometimes I think as we journey in life, and maybe to Jackie's point earlier, is that sometimes I think we can become spectators of watching how other people are standing up for issues that are may not be necessarily social justice that we but it may be just standing up for what's right when we see people maybe gossiping about other people or treating people unfairly. That do we have the courage that even in the small quote unquote civil rights that we experience, do we have the courage to be able to stand up when everyone else may be sitting down or staying quiet? And I think that's something that I think that's very much at the core of our Orthodox theology, is that no, we cannot be a spectator. We're called to actually be to carry those burdens as Christ talks about to Paul, through St. Paul. You're listening to once again to Live with the Lows. We're speaking with Father Paul Abernathy, and really just kind of sharing about Martin Luther King Jr. and the role that the Orthodox Church played within the civil rights movement, and not only just kind of going down memory lane, but also talking as we'll talk to after our break in a few moments about truly how African American spirituality and how that relates to our Orthodox Christian Church. So we do encourage you again to call in if you're interested at 1-855-237-2346. That's 1-855-237-2346. You can email us a question at ask@ancientfaith.com. That's ask@ancientfaith.com. Father Paul, I think you may have been alluding to this as well. When Martin Luther King talks about the dark night of the soul, maybe can you just kind of expand a little bit more on that topic?
As I had mentioned earlier, he did have this experience especially during the Montgomery bus boycott. And what I would say is, it's when we really hear him speak about this, this midnight of the soul, as he said, he really is understanding this as a spiritual struggle, or there's a spiritual nature to this struggle. This is very consistent in the African American experience, even still today, where there's not this understanding that it's just politics, or it's just social justice, or it's just this or just that, where there's a strong sense that there's a spiritual quality to this life, there's a spiritual quality to the struggle. And certainly he knew that, and he understood that. How he really handled that, what he really did with that when he went through this midnight of the soul, as he describes, he really became a man of prayer. And let me tell you about the kind of prayer that he prayed. This is the kind of prayer that I have to believe that he really learned from his youth. I see Martin Luther King Jr. as a great inheritor of a spirituality that was forged in suffering. And so when he experienced this midnight of the soul, it was not new to him, nor was he confused as to what he had to do, because it was an experience that was to be found throughout African American history, where people, given the context of oppression and suffering that they had experienced generation after generation, had experienced this deep spiritual pain as a result of the oppression that they faced. And in the face of that pain, or in the context of that pain, people really began to cry out in prayer. I had heard the Psalms described as the cry of the human heart. And this is really, I think, characterizes the way in which many African Americans prayed, even in many ways still today continues to pray. We're crying out to God in excruciating agony. And whenever you hear about Martin Luther King's experience in this way, it wasn't that he simply prayed, it's that he understood in the context of the spiritual heritage how to allow his heart to cry out to God, even if in that moment he didn't feel that God was with him. He was crying out from the depth of his heart and soul to God with belief that his prayers would be heard. And ultimately it was those prayers, that cry of his heart, that carried him through, and ultimately from his perspective brought the grace of God to carry on through the struggle that ultimately even claimed his life.
It reminds me of what we in the Orthodox Church, as you well know, and how many of our listeners know, how we sing during the Vesper service, Lord, I cried out to you, hear me, hear my, and I think that's something that is so beautiful within our Orthodox tradition. It's just this, not just this prayer that's just a verbal prayer, and I share that respectfully towards all Christian traditions, that that God doesn't want our mouth, He wants our heart, and that crying, that deep crying that comes really from the heart, is what I would argue is the kind of worship that I think pleases our God. We've been talking to Father Paul Abernathy. He's the CEO of Neighborhood Resilience Project in Pittsburgh, outside of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, about the great work that he's doing, but also about the role that the Orthodox Church played in the civil rights movement alongside Martin Luther King Jr. We're going to take a quick break. On the other side of this break, we're going to be talking to Father Paul about his brand new book that's coming out next month, entitled The Prayer of a Broken Heart. Listen to this: An Orthodox Christian Reflection on African American Spirituality. So stay right with us as we talk more with Father Paul Abernathy.
Live with the Lows with Father Nick and Dr. Roxanne will be back in a moment. Give them a call at 855-237-2346. That's 855-AF-RADIO. They would love to hear from you.
Are you struggling in your walk with Christ? Do you want to rediscover your reason for living, the person you were created to be? Renewing You, a priest, a psychologist, and a plan gives you the keys to unlock areas of your life that hold you back from fully experiencing the renewal and transformation God has in mind for you. Co-authored by a priest and a psychologist, Father Nicholas and Dr. Roxanne Lowe, Renewing You combines principles of spiritual growth with psychological tools to help you become your best self, fully connected with God's purpose for you. To purchase this book, please go to store.ancientfaith.com. That's store.ancientfaith.com.
We're back with Live with the Lows and Father Nick and Dr. Roxanne. Do you have a question for the Lows? Call in now at 855-237-2346. That's 855-AF-RADIO. Here once again is Father Nick and Dr. Roxanne.
Well, welcome back everyone to Live with the Lows. We're so grateful
that you're joining us tonight. Before we get back to our amazing speaker, Father Paul Abernathy, I do want to encourage all of you, if you haven't already, if you're looking for some inspirational encouragement all throughout your week, just right now go to our website at thelows.com. That's LOUHS.com. Click on the subscribe button, and all you have to do is simply put in your email address. There's no strings attached. Just simply, Roxanne and I just want to give you a word of encouragement all throughout the week. So definitely take advantage of that. And if you are already receiving those messages, do us a favor. Tell your friends about it. We truly believe that we should be sharing God's light. And if it's a light to you, chances are it's going to be a light to your friends and family. So right now, maybe just send an email to one of your friends and say, look, join the Lows Daily Inspirational Messages. We promise you that will continue to encourage you as best as we are through God's grace. Peace. And I also just wanted to once again encourage you to join the conversation. You can join us by calling in at 1-855-237-2346. That's 1-855-237-2346, or email us at ask@ancientfaith.com. We're also broadcasting live on our social media platforms, on the Lowe's Facebook page, as well as Ancient Faith. So, Father Paul, I'm so excited about your brand new book, and I want to really spend some time in the second half of the show talking about that. The title of the book is The Prayer of a Broken Heart, an Orthodox Christian Reflection on African American Spirituality. And that title has so much, it's so packed full of so many different meanings, and I just really would like to just start by asking you, what motivated you to write this book?
I think it's often been the case that for a lot of people looking from the outside in, they see sort of the African American, the black experience in America, and they look at the Orthodox Church, and people sometimes see externally that they couldn't seem more different. I've noticed over the years where people talk about how we introduced the Orthodox Christian faith to African Americans, somehow it seems like it's a different sort of a task. And I realize that this is in the context of our honestly, our racial history in America, that really always tries to find and emphasize difference among the races. And yet, from my own personal experience and really interacting with African Americans both inside and outside of the Orthodox Church, it just became so apparent to me that there was so much that resonated in the African American experience and African American spirituality. There's so much about Orthodox Christianity that resonates in that spiritual and historical context, and that oftentimes whenever I had a chance to really read slave narratives and compare that in my own pastoral ministry to the types of things that people say, to the types of things that people do, and really then reflect on patristic writings and the writings of the saints, the church fathers, our righteous forefathers, our righteous mothers in the church, and what they would say, and what they would teach, and what they would advise. It seemed to me so incredibly relevant to the experience of African Americans, both historically and culturally, and certainly spiritually. It's often been the case that when I have our church, our parish, in our ministry, St. Moses the Black, our parish, our ministry, the Neighborhood Resilience Project, is both of which are located predominantly in the black community. Much of our ministry happens in the black community. It's not that we exclusively serve African Americans, but they are the majority of people we interact with via the ministry, and it's just been so consistently the case that I can't really remember having to explain icons too much. I can't remember having to explain incense. I can't even remember having to explain our chant or the way we sing in church. It seems almost to me that people, they recognize it with their heart when they see it. That was so curious to me, and led me on this deep exploration of what about the black experience in America made people recognize Orthodox Christianity with their hearts whenever they were in the midst of it. What about that black experience that really seemed to, which really seemed to cause some of these great questions about our liturgical differences to fade away? What about that black experience made people feel at home when they stepped in the Orthodox Church? And sort of that's my pastoral experience, but I then had the privilege. I had the privilege of just spending many hours in exploration of the slave narratives, of these first account writings, to understand how the story of the African American experience, just like the previous caller had mentioned, we don't talk about Martin Luther King and his love for Christ so much, and yet that was who he was. We don't tell the story of the African American experience that way either. And yet, when you really look at it, Christ is at the center of that experience, and it happened also in the context of, again, unimaginable suffering. And so all of this really led me me to, and I should also say that this was affirmed even further by the Fellowship of St. Moses the Black. And for those who do not know, the Fellowship of St. Moses the Black, the founding president, Father Moses Berry, and Father Alexia Altshull, and Father Jerome Sanderson, Mother Catherine Weston, and Dr. Carla Thomas, and many others, began to affirm that this was consistent with their experience as well. And so all of this really compelled me to try to really write a story that many people do not know, to share a narrative that is often forgotten or undermined even in broader American society. And I knew that it was extraordinarily important to do that, especially in the aftermath of George Floyd, that presented an opportunity and also revealed confusion in the hearts of many as to not only how this happened, but how do we move forward as a nation. And so with all of that, I thought this was really the right time, and of course the good people in ancient faith, so gracious, so encouraging, so helpful in the process of writing, publishing the book. I'm just so very grateful for that support to share this story.
Father Paul, I really want to, at some point before the end of the show, is really to kind of hear your story in the Orthodox Church. I think that our listeners would love to hear that as well. But we have a caller. Terry is calling. Terry, welcome to Live with the Lows.
Good evening, Father. Thank you so much for taking my call.
Thank you.
I'm enjoying really hearing this conversation, and I want to offer a couple of thoughts. And I'll ask you to bear with me because I do stutter a little bit, so just please have a little grace with me.
Sure, absolutely.
I'd like to know more about what the Orthodox Church, whether it's clergy or laity, what's being done to deal with racial unrest that we see now. And I ask that from two perspectives. From voting suppression. I had an incident right here in Jacksonville, Florida, back in 2012 when I was approaching a polling place where the door was shut and locked in my face, in mine and another black woman who was with me. And I just never thought I would live that in the 21st century as my parents did before me. And another thing that I've had to deal with, my oldest sister was killed in a racially motivated attack, much like Heather Heyer was, the young white girl in Charlottesville, I believe it was. That's how I lost my sister back in 1985. And in the grand scheme of civil rights, that's not terribly long ago. And as we listen to the poison that comes from people who dislike us because of our skin color, it seems the temperature is getting worse and worse. And I would really like to know more about what the church is doing about that, especially being non-Orthodox. I'm Christian, but I'm not Orthodox. And one other point, Father, Paul was talking about what it is that might bring African Americans to a quicker understanding of Orthodoxy. I think one thing is the church mother. I think you all call the Theotokos, is that correct?
Yes, ma'am.
All right. In Catholicism, of course, we call her the Blessed Mother and other names, but in the traditional black church in Protestantism, we have church mothers, and they are the older ladies who have been through a lot, who have prayed through some difficult times, and those are the people that we would go to get a prayer through if we were struggling with something. So having the Mother of God uplifted like that may be very relevant to African Americans looking at Orthodoxy. Now, I'll go ahead and take my answer off the air. Thank you again for this conversation.
Thank you so much, Terry, so much for calling in and sharing your story. Father Paul, I think that Terry brings up some great points. I mean, can you let's just try to discuss maybe just how the relevance of the really what the Orthodox Church is doing towards racial justice within our country.
Yes, certainly. And Ms. Terry, thank you so much for your comments and for calling in. Yeah, I really appreciate you calling us to mind that there is still really work for us to do. I will tell you, the Orthodox Church is doing more in the realm of racial justice and reconciliation. Certainly in the aftermath of George Floyd, there was a lot of activity across the church to try to promote and inform Orthodox Christians as to how we ought not only to respond in a moment of crisis, but how we ought to champion the dignity and value of every human life. In that particular context, focusing on people of color. I will tell you that also today. Yesterday was Martin Luther King Day, but today is in 2016, the Kellogg Foundation proclaimed the day after Martin Luther King Day, the National Day of Racial Reconciliation. Earlier today, I was at an event with the mayor of Pittsburgh for the proclamations on racial reconciliation, and I will tell you, this is an important day for us as Americans to say that this now, it might have been the work of previous generations to really strive for political rights, but what we see is that just, Ms. Terry, as you rightly say, that just to strive for political rights alone, it doesn't solve the deeper issue of that division that we have in our humanity as a result of sin. People often say, well, we haven't really had racial reconciliation in this country, but I would contend that that reconciliation is the ministry of the church, and if we haven't had it, it's because we in the church haven't done the work. So this is our day. I believe that this is a day is dawning in which we are being called to be champions of racial reconciliation. And in this, I personally see Orthodox Christian clergy and Orthodox Christian laity being raised up to do this incredibly profound work. Now, at the same time, we've got to acknowledge that if the rights of our brothers and sisters are being infringed upon, we must speak against that, and we must do so with the same radical love that Martin Luther King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference had, where we're not doing so in hatred. And again, we're not trying to win some kind of political victory, but we seek rather justice and reconciliation. We seek the healing of our sin, of our fallen nature. We seek the healing of our humanity, which we know this racism is a devastating result of that sin which has wounded us all. I personally believe also that this is a new day for the Orthodox Church, because really, if you look at in America, because if you really look at the history of the Orthodox Church in America, well, people say, well, where has the Orthodox Church been? Why has the Orthodox Church done more ministry? In the 20th century alone, there were 40 million Orthodox Christians, 40 million Orthodox Christians martyred. You look at the suffering that went on in the Ottoman Empire under the Soviets in Russia, the communists in Romania and Bulgaria, etc., etc. You see the level of suffering that our church experienced, that even in this new land where white supremacy again was against these Orthodox Christian ethnic minorities, where people were just trying not to be seen. But now we have many, the church has been here for decades now, over a century. Certainly we have many Americans who have no ethnic ties to the Orthodox Church coming into the Orthodox Church here in America. We see that we began with St. Tikhon and St. Raphael of Brooklyn with the monastery. St. Tikhon's monastery was the first monastery in the lower 48, and now we have more monasteries. We have the patristic writings is translated into English, many of them. We have Orthodox Study Bible in English, and we have camps, and now we're beginning to see in this particular generation, like ours, ministries that are emerging. And what's really fast, if you look at the Neighborhood Resilience Project, it says the mission of the Neighborhood Resilience Project, the opening line of the mission is rooted in the gospel and teaching of the Orthodox Church, inspired by the civil rights movement. Now, can you imagine that we have an Orthodox Christian ministry that starts out like that? This is the work of the Holy Spirit in its national progression. We're going to see more work of the church in the area of justice and reconciliation, not according to the understanding of the world, but according to the gospel in our Holy Orthodox Church. I believe that we're going to see much more of it in the days ahead.
That's beautiful. I think that's so true. I think that, what we're seeing more of is not only just the reality that the story of the civil rights movement is our story, that our church, our history of the Orthodox Christian Church, as you beautifully stated, 40 million martyrs. It's extraordinary that I think so. That sometimes I think one of I guess it's a silver lining, if you will, with what living in this great nation that provides us so many opportunities, so much freedom, is that sometimes we can sometimes forget where we were, not only historically in this country, but historically as a church, where we were 100 years ago around the world, and still, as we mentioned at the top of the show, that there's still a great deal of oppression and persecution going on around the world towards people of faith. And so we talked about that last week on our show when we were interviewing the authors of the book Syria Crucified. Father Paul, we only have a few moments left before our show ends. I just would love to hear your story. Just maybe tell us a little bit about your story, and then also, if you can, I'd love to know what has been your experience in introducing the Orthodox faith to African Americans.
Sure. Well, for me, I was very blessed. Sure. Well, for me, I was very blessed because I was an international studies major in college, and I somehow thought I could get that degree without studying overseas, foolishly. And in my junior year, my advisor reminded me that I could not get the degree unless I studied overseas. And many people know on my father's side I'm African American, on my mother's side I have Syrian heritage, and so he knew this, and so he said, I found a place for you to study at the University of Aleppo, in Aleppo, Syria. Now, this is the year 2000. And I thought, okay, I'll apply to the program. I didn't think I'd get in, and sure enough, I got in. So I said, well, I guess I have to go study at the University of Aleppo. And but I was a Christian. I was not Orthodox. I was not raised in the Orthodox Church. I had some, I knew of the Orthodox Church. I had some extended family who were Orthodox, but I was not Orthodox. And what happened to me was I right before I was going over to Syria, I wanted to see what Christianity was like in Syria. So I found an Antiochian church, an Antiochian Orthodox church, and I wanted to just go there more or less as a sociological observation. And so I attended this divine liturgy at St. George in Bridgeville, an Antiochian Orthodox church in Bridgeville, Pennsylvania, outside of Pittsburgh. And what happened to me in that liturgy, I was completely unprepared for. It had this, what I can only describe as a profound and mystical encounter with the living God. And that liturgy just changed my life. I remember leaving so astonished, because I had not been seeking anything like this. And I spent, I will tell you, the months after that, I tried to get my hands on as much as I could to read about the Orthodox Church, but it was only really trying to help my mind catch up to where my heart already was. It was just a matter of time, and I knew that God was present in this liturgy. I knew that I had experienced something sacred. I knew that I experienced something heavenly, and I just wanted I wanted it so much after having experienced it. So that sooner or later I became Orthodox, an Orthodox Christian. Thank God. And I'll tell you that since that time, and again, I remember thinking at some point, well, it's so beautiful, but I do have this African American heritage. I guess that's just not going to be. I'm not really going to be able to bring that with me into this church. But much to my surprise, when I was in seminary, especially, got to again through the Fellowship of St. Moses the Black, find that there were African American Orthodox Christians who not only became Orthodox, but really became Orthodox in a way that celebrated and fulfilled the African American spiritual heritage. For me now, that's been very frequently my experience as I share the faith with African Americans, because we speak in terms as Orthodox Christians that many African Americans really can understand. This idea of redemptive suffering, this idea of sorrowful joy, the mystery of the cross, this understanding that we are not citizens, that we are seeking to be citizens of the kingdom, this otherworldly focus, this otherworldly peace. This is how we speak. And even if you look at, you talk about the 40 million martyrs, Father. We don't generally make a huge deal out of that, outside of the church, because for us, we are at peace with that, because we find the grace of God in the blood of the martyrs, that even in their martyrdom, we see God's glory. And this is also consistent with African American spiritual heritage. And so being able to have this shared language, and even to let people know that there is a way of understanding and fulfilling what all of our ancestors have in previous generations raised us up in this time now to receive, has been very, very powerful part of our experience.
I just love hearing that. And just, as someone that, obviously is, can read and to study, but to hear someone, who's an African American speak about that, the beauty that the Orthodox Church provides and shares, and the similarities, I think is so eye-opening. I think I know for myself, and I'm sure for all of our listeners. Father Paul, I'm sure there's going to be many people that are going to want to just find out more about the Neighborhood Resilience Project. In our last few moments, can you tell us, your website, and just really ways that people can find out more about what you're doing in your ministry?
Sure, Father. Neighborhoodresilience.org. Neighborhoodresilience.org. Please check us out. You can go on there. There are certainly ways to get involved. If you're in the greater Pittsburgh area, there are always opportunities to engage. We have people traveling to spend time with us all the time, to travel, spend some time, and serve. We have people who come to us for trainings of different sort, and we even go and do trainings for people in other cities as well. There's lots of opportunity. Please check us out, and keep us in your prayers. This work is very, very, the ministry is very beautiful. It's very challenging at the same time. So certainly all of those who are involved in this ministry need your prayers. Please remember us, and certainly we'll keep you in our prayers as well.
Father Paul, I just want you to know how grateful I am that you've taken the time to be here on Live with the Lows tonight. Again, the book that's going to be coming out, it's not out yet. Next month it'll be coming out on Ancient Faith. It's called The Prayer of a Broken Heart, an Orthodox Christian Reflection on African American Spirituality. You'll be able to find it at store.ancientfaith.com. I do want to just remind all of you that to stay connected to us, to join our social media platforms, all under the headings of The Lows, as well as join, if you'd like to receive our daily inspirational messages. Go to thelows.com and simply just put in your email address when you click on that subscribe button. And finally, next Tuesday's show is going to be equally an amazing show. We're going to be speaking to the authors of a brand new book called Hope Upon Impact. The author is Julie Overlease, and her daughter, 12 years old, was struck by a large tree that almost killed her. This is a story of hope, faith, of having amazing friends around. This is a show that you definitely want to bring your friends and family for. So it's next Tuesday right here on Live with the Lows. I want to thank Matushka Trudy for producing tonight's show, as always, doing an amazing job. All of the emails, I wish I could have gotten to all of them, and to all the phone calls. Perhaps, Father Paul, we can bring you back on the show when the book officially comes out to just talk more about that, because our email list, our inbox is filled with questions. But I do want to thank all of our listeners for joining again. We love having you part of Live with the Lows. And God bless you all, and stay strong in your walk of faith.
Father Nick and Dr. Roxanne are the authors of the book Renewing You, a priest, a psychologist, and a plan, which can be purchased at store.ancientfaith.com. Their daily inspirational messages can be found at thelows.com/subscribe. Be sure also to search for The Lows on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. Live with the Lows is a listener-supported presentation of Ancient Faith Radio.
Hello, everyone. It's Father Nicholas Lowe with Live with the Lows, a show right here on Ancient Faith Radio. And I want to tell you about an amazing in-person retreat that I hope that you and your spouse can attend. Ancient Faith is hosting a Makeover Your Marriage retreat in which Roxanne and I will be hosting and speaking at this retreat. It's February